Welcome to Sleepy Owl. The Persian war machines were gone, but their memory etched a new reality into the stone of history. Sparta, the austere kingdom of the Peloponnese, found itself suddenly, irrevocably, thrust into a role it had never sought, the acknowledged leader of the Greek world. Its warriors, those figures of bronze and scarlet who had held the line when all seemed lost, returned not merely as heroes, but as living monuments. Their very appearance, the crimson cloth, the shield's bold insignia, now stirred not just fear, but a profound, grudging respect from every corner of the Hellenic lands. They were the saviors. And with that title came a burden of influence as heavy as any phalanx's spear. In the years that followed, the political landscape of Greece began to crystallize around two poles. To the east, Athens, with its eyes on the sea and its mind on commerce, wove a web of alliances built on ships and silver. But here, in the rugged south, Sparta charted a different course. Its power was not of the waves, but of the earth, rooted in land, in tradition, in the slow, deliberate step of the infantryman. It turned its attention inward, to the peninsula it called home, and began to consolidate its grip with a patience that was itself a form of power. The mechanism for this was not a new empire, but an old alliance refined. The League of Peloponnesian Cities, a fellowship that had existed for generations, was transformed under Spartan guidance. It became something more deliberate, more potent. Where Athens would build an empire demanding tribute, Sparta crafted a hegemony that asked for soldiers. This was a crucial distinction, one that shaped everything to come. Member cities kept their own laws, their own customs, their sense of self. They were not subjects, but partners, at least in theory. But when the call to arms came from Sparta, they were expected to answer. Can a league built on mutual defense become an instrument of dominance, all while maintaining the graceful fiction of equality? This system gave Sparta something incredible, the ability to summon an army of a scale unimaginable for a single city-state. At its core, the unbreakable wall of Spartan peers, the professional soldiers who were the state. Flanking them, the hoplites of Corinth, of Thebes, of a dozen other cities, each with their own armor, their own pride, but moving now as part of a single, terrifying machine. The sight of this combined force, 30,000 strong, a forest of spears and shields rippling across the valleys, was the ultimate argument. Few could oppose it, fewer still would dare. It was the physical manifestation of Sparta's new reality. But how long can such a force be maintained, not by conquest, but by consent? The true genius of this Spartan system lay not just in its military might, but in its diplomacy. There was a council, a meeting place for all the allies. Representatives could speak, grievances could be aired, decisions could be debated. It was a forum that preserved dignity, that offered a voice. Yet, in that chamber, the weight of Sparta's prestige, the memory of its sacrifices, and the implicit threat of its army hung in the air like incense. The debate was real, but the conclusion was often preordained. Smaller states, ones that had once bristled under Spartan ambition, now found a strange comfort in this arrangement. They traded a measure of freedom for a guarantee of security, for a place at the table under Sparta's firm but steady hand. Was this a golden cage, or a genuine partnership for a turbulent age? This entire, elegant structure of power rested on one vital, unwavering foundation, the internal stability of Sparta itself. The society that demanded such discipline from its allies had to be a masterpiece of order at home. And at its heartbeat, a unique and complex system of governance, a threefold cord designed to prevent any single thread from fraying the entire tapestry. There was not one king, but two, a dual monarchy born of ancient compromise. These royal lines, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, served as a natural check on each other. While one led armies on distant campaigns, embodying the state's martial might, the other remained in the homeland, tending to the delicate threads of administration and tradition. It was a balance of absence and presence, of war and peace, woven into the very fabric of rule. But the kings did not reign alone. Above them in wisdom, if not always in direct authority, sat the Gerousia, the council of elders. 28 men, each having seen 6 decades or more, elected to serve for life. To their number were added the 2 kings, creating a chamber of 30. These were not mere politicians. They were living archives of Spartan law and custom, veterans of countless battles and diplomatic struggles. Their faces were maps of experience, their deliberations slow, measured, and steeped in a profound conservatism. They met in shadows, their voices low, shaping the grand strategy of the state with a focus on preserving what was, rather than chasing what might be. Their power was the power of precedent, immense and unyielding. What happens when the world changes, but the council's wisdom is frozen in the past? Completing this triad was a body of 5 men, chosen not by birth, but by the voice of the citizen assembly each year. The Evers. Theirs was a startling, democratic counterweight in this aristocratic system. They held authority that could make kings tremble. They could depose a monarch, oversee the complex web of Spartan law, and stand as the direct representatives of the people's will. They were the enforcers, the auditors, the daily face of governance in the public square. Accessible to any Spartan citizen, they ensured that the immense machinery of state never drifted too far from the concerns of those it was built to serve. The king might command the army, but the Ephor could call him to account. It was a system of distributed power, ingenious in its balance. But could such a delicate balance hold when true crisis, the kind that bends all institutions, finally arrived? The strength of Sparta's golden age was built upon this tripod of kings, elders, and overseers. Each leg was essential. Remove one, and the entire structure risked a catastrophic collapse. Beyond the halls of government, the true engine of Spartan power hummed with a rhythm all its own. It was the rhythm of the agoge, the relentless training system that forged boys into weapons of the state. From the age of 7, a Spartan male ceased to be merely a child. He became a raw material to be tempered. Separated from the comforts of home, he entered a world of calculated hardship, of communal living, of contests that blurred the line between play and survival. This was not merely education, it was a ritual of transformation, designed to strip away individuality and weld loyalty to the group. The goal was not to create a man who thought for himself, but a soldier who would unthinkingly die for his brothers. Can a society that devours the individualism of its youth truly sustain innovation, or does it merely perfect a singular, devastating art? This art was the hoplite phalanx. The Spartan military machine was a masterpiece of terrifying simplicity. Its power did not lie in complex maneuvers or clever tactics, but in flawless, brutal execution. While other Greek armies were militias, farmers and craftsmen who took up arms when needed, the Spartan force was professional. Their entire existence was a rehearsal for war. They moved as one organism, a wall of bronze and wood that advanced with a slow, terrifying certainty. The sound of their advance was not a ragged cry, but the deep, rhythmic chant of the paean, the stomp of countless feet in perfect unison. To face them was to face not just an army, but an idea. The idea that human will could be made as solid and unforgiving as a mountain. But what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? And what if that object is the slow, creeping decay of time itself? The society that produced such soldiers was a closed world, a pressure cooker of discipline. It was obsessed with purity, with maintaining the exact way of life that had delivered them supremacy. Foreign influences were viewed with deep suspicion. New ideas were often seen as corruptions. The Spartans even had a word for this fear of the outside: xenalasia, the periodic expulsion of foreigners. Their currency was not gold or silver, but heavy iron bars, useless for trade beyond their borders, ensuring economic isolation. This was a culture that built walls not just of stone, but of tradition, deliberately turning inward to preserve what it believed was a perfect and perfectly fragile way of life. Could such a fortress, however strong, ever truly adapt? Or was its greatest strength also its fatal flaw, a recipe for magnificent stagnation? And yet, for a time, this system delivered unparalleled stability and prestige. The wealth of the state, such as it was, flowed from a foundation that was both its backbone and its original sin, the Helots. These were not slaves in the conventional sense, but a subjugated population, the original inhabitants of the lands Sparta had conquered centuries before. They worked the fields, tended the flocks, and performed the labors that freed the Spartan citizen for a life of constant military training. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans by a terrifying margin. Their existence was a constant, silent counterpoint to the glory of the warrior elite, a vast, resentful sea upon which the Spartan ship of state precariously sailed. Every Spartan man came of age not just in the Agoge, but in the Cryptia, a secret rite where young men were sent to live off the land and, it was whispered, to cull the Helot population to remind them of their place through terror. The entire splendid edifice of Spartan power was built upon this quaking ground of systemic fear. How can a society look outward for conquest when it must forever glance over its shoulder at the enemy within? For decades, the system worked with a grim efficiency. The Peloponnesian League, under Sparta's steady hand, kept the peace in southern Greece. When conflict did arise, the Spartan response was swift and decisive. Their reputation alone was often enough to settle disputes. Kings led campaigns, won victories, and returned to honors. The Ephors managed the domestic balance. The Gerousia provided unchanging counsel. The Helots remained, for the most part, quiescent. It was an age of equilibrium, a golden afternoon that seemed as if it could last forever. Sparta was not just a city, it was an ideal made flesh, a theorem of power proven on the battlefields of history. Other states might grow rich, or artistically brilliant, or navally dominant, but none could claim the sheer, awe-inspiring perfection of the Spartan military machine. They were the arbiters, the final word in the quarrels of the Greek world. But no afternoon, however golden, avoids the coming of twilight. The first cracks in this perfect facade were not dramatic collapses, but hairline fractures, almost too fine to see. They began where stagnation often breeds, in the very population that was the source of Sparta's strength. The number of full Spartan citizens, the homoioi or equals, was never large. Their rigorous lifestyle, the constant risk of war, and strict laws governing inheritance began, slowly but inexorably, to thin their ranks. A man could lose his coveted status for failing to contribute to his communal dining group, for showing cowardice, or simply through poverty. And with each citizen lost, the wall of the phalanx grew a little thinner, the balance between the rulers and the vast Helot population grew a little more perilous. The society that prized quality over quantity was discovering a bitter mathematical truth. You cannot dilute a pure substance forever without losing its essence. The outside world, which Sparta had tried so hard to hold at bay, also began to press in. The true challenge emerged not from the scattered city-states of the Peloponnese, but from the rising power it had once fought alongside, Athens. The Delian League, Athens's maritime alliance, had steadily transformed into an empire. Silver flowed into its coffers, its navy ruled the Aegean, and its culture, vibrant, questioning, innovative, stood in stark contrast to Sparta's austere conservatism. Two worlds, two ideologies were on a collision course. One valued the collective, discipline, and tradition above all. The other celebrated the individual, commerce, and democratic change. The conflict between them would not be just a war for territory, but a war for the soul of Greece itself. Could the land-bound lion of Sparta defeat the oceanic eagle of Athens? And even in victory, what cost would such a struggle exact on a society built for a different, simpler age of warfare? The inevitable clash, when it came, would be long, grinding, and catastrophic for all of Greece. The Peloponnesian War, a decades-long struggle, would test the Spartan system as nothing had before. It would demand not just brief, glorious campaigns, but sustained military commitment far from home. It would require a navy, an arm of war Sparta had always disdained. It would force them to campaign for years on end, exposing their citizens to foreign ideas and luxuries. The war would be a furnace, and Sparta would be thrust into its heart. The tripod of government, the rigid social order, the economic isolation, all would be subjected to intolerable heat and strain. The Golden Age was ending. The age of iron, of difficult choices and eroded certainties, was about to begin. The fall was not a single event, but a long, slow slide, and the first, almost imperceptible, descent started here, at the very height of their power. The drums of war, when they finally sounded, did not begin with a grand declaration. They started with a whisper of conflict in a distant, minor city, a spark that landed on the bone-dried tinder of Greek rivalry. Corinth and Athens squabbled over a peripheral ally. Appeals were made. The Peloponnesian League assembled, its members looking toward Sparta, the hegemon, for leadership. Within the shadowy chamber of the Gerousia, the elders debated. Caution was their instinct. War with Athens was a leap into the unknown, a fight against a different kind of power. But the voices of the allies and the younger, more ambitious kings pressed for action. The very system that gave Sparta authority now demanded it use that authority. To hesitate was to show weakness, to risk the loyalty of the League. Could the guarantor of security refuse to confront a growing threat? The vote was taken. The path was chosen. The long war had its reluctant architect. So began the great test. In the early years, Spartan strategy played to its historic strengths. When the Athenian army ventured onto the plains, the Spartan phalanx would meet it, and with brutal, predictable efficiency, shatter it. The clash was not of strategy, but of essence. The amateur, however brave, could not stand before the professional. These victories reaffirmed the old truths, the sacred dogma of Spartan supremacy on land. They fed the legend. But Athens, led by the cunning Pericles, refused to play by Sparta's rules. When the lion advanced, the eagle simply took to the sea. The Athenians withdrew behind their massive long walls, a fortified corridor linking their city to the port of Piraeus. From there, their unmatched fleet ruled the waves, supplying the city and striking Spartan coasts at will. Sparta found itself in a frustrating, alien predicament. It was undefeatable, yet unable to land a decisive blow. How do you strangle a ghost? How do you break a wall that is also a highway? This new form of war stretched the Spartan system in uncomfortable ways. Campaigns could no longer be the brief, seasonal affairs of the past. Spartan soldiers, bred for quick, decisive clashes, now found themselves sitting idle for months outside Athenian territory, their discipline fraying with boredom and pestilence. For the first time, they were exposed not just to battle, but to the creeping influence of the world beyond their borders. They saw the wealth of Attica, the relative freedom of other Greek lives. Subtle questions, once unthinkable, could now take root in the mind of a warrior standing a long, watchful vigil. Was the Spartan way the only way? Or was it merely one way, and a peculiarly harsh one at that? The strain reached back to the heart of Sparta itself. The need to maintain armies in the field year after year placed unbearable pressure on the fragile citizen population. Every fallen warrior was not just a loss of life, but a loss of a rare, irreplaceable component of the state's machinery. The ranks of the homoioi, already a concern, began to shrink at an alarming rate. Furthermore, the war demanded new tools. To truly throttle Athens, Sparta needed to contest the sea. This meant building a fleet, a venture that required vast sums of money, something the Spartan iron currency economy did not possess. They were forced to look outward, to seek the gold of an old enemy to defeat a current one. The unthinkable alliance was brokered. Ambassadors traveled east, to the glittering court of the Persian Empire. The saviors of Greece now sat with the heirs of Xerxes, negotiating for Persian coin to build ships to destroy the other savior of Greece. It was a profound, cynical compromise. What does it do to a society's soul when it must consort with the very devil it once gloriously defeated? This Faustian bargain bore fruit, but it was a poisoned harvest. With Persian wealth, Sparta could finally build a navy capable of challenging Athens. The victory, when it came, was not won on the hallowed ground of the phalanx, but in the treacherous waters of the Hellespont. At Aegospotami, a Spartan admiral, Lysander, using guile as much as force, annihilated the Athenian fleet. The siege was now total. Athens, starved and broken, surrendered. The war was over. Sparta stood triumphant, the undisputed master of the Greek world. The long struggle had ended in their favor. The eagle was grounded. The lion roared its victory across the Aegean. It was the zenith, the moment of absolute supremacy. But the cost of reaching this peak had already hollowed out the climber. The victory party was held in a house whose foundations had been quietly rotting for years. In the wake of triumph, Sparta faced a new and unfamiliar question. What now? Having destroyed the Athenian Empire, it inherited its problems. Suddenly, Sparta was not just the leader of the Peloponnese, but the hegemon of an entire maritime sphere it did not understand. Its solution was a retreat into its oldest instincts: control and imposition. Instead of the relatively light-handed leadership of the Peloponnesian League, Sparta installed brutal, narrow-minded governors known as harmasts in conquered cities. These were often ambitious, lesser Spartans or even mercenaries, hungry for wealth and power. They ruled with the boot, not the balanced hand. The sophisticated fiction of allied partnership was discarded. Sparta's rule became crude, extractive, and deeply hated. Worse still, the victory gold from Persia did not stop flowing. It corrupted the very core of the Spartan ideal. For centuries, Spartan society had been engineered to prevent the accumulation of private wealth, to ensure that no citizen placed his own interests above the state's. Now, a flood of foreign silver and gold poured into the hands of a few victorious generals like Lysander, kings, and their cronies. For the first time, a visible, jarring inequality sprang up between Spartans. The ancient laws against hoarding wealth were ignored. The ideal of the equals became a cruel joke. The bonds of communal discipline, forged in the fire of the agoge, began to rust under the slow drip of luxury and greed. The victory had not strengthened the Spartan system. It had introduced the virus that would attack it from within. Can a society founded on discipline and equality survive its own sudden, corrupting wealth? The answer was beginning to form, and it was written not on a victory stele, but in the quiet, desperate whispers of a people losing their way. Peace, it turned out, was a more corrosive enemy than Athens had ever been. In war, the Spartan machine had a purpose, a clear enemy to focus its relentless energy. But in victory, that energy had nowhere to go but inward. The sudden influx of wealth and power acted like a solvent, eating away at the mortar that held the ancient system together. The austere mess halls, where all Spartan men had dined on simple fare as equals, now saw subtle distinctions. A general might contribute finer wine. A king's friend might wear a less faded cloak. These were small things, whispers of change, but in a society built on absolute conformity, whispers can sound like earthquakes. The very concept of homoioi, the equals, began to crack under the weight of new gold. What good is a wall of identical shields when the men behind them no longer see the world through the same eyes? The corruption seeped into the highest offices. The dual kingship, once a balance, became a battleground for rival factions swollen with Persian treasure. Ambitious kings like Agesilaus pursued personal glory in foreign campaigns, their eyes on building their own legend rather than tending the Spartan garden. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, found its authority challenged by returning war heroes who commanded the loyalty of armies and the allure of plunder. The Ephors, meant to be the people's check on power, were themselves not immune to bribery and influence. The clean, balanced lines of the government grew blurry, tangled in the web of private ambition that victory had spun. The institutions designed for a poor, inward-looking state were buckling under the demands of a rich, overstretched empire. Where does a society turn when its own rules no longer fit the world it has conquered? This internal decay had a direct, military consequence: the decline of the citizen soldier. The shrinking pool of full Spartiates was now a crisis. Losses from the long war had not been replenished. The strict laws of inheritance meant that families without a male heir saw their land pass to others, creating a class of dispossessed, impoverished Spartans who lost their status and their place in the phalanx. These men, called hypomyones or inferiors, simmered with resentment. They had been raised in the agoge, they knew the art of war, but they were now excluded from the society they were born to defend. The mighty wall of the phalanx was not just thinning, its very bricks were becoming unstable, some polished and gilded, others cracked and cast aside. How can you maintain an unbreakable front when the bonds between the men in the line are fraying? The external world, which Sparta now presumed to command, pushed back with violent force. The very allies who had helped them defeat Athens chafed under the heavy, clumsy hand of Spartan rule. In Thebes, a city long dominated by Sparta, a spark of rebellion was struck. It was fanned into a flame by a small band of exiles and a daring, secret return. Before the Spartan Harmost knew what was happening, the citadel of Thebes was seized. The rebellion succeeded. It was a stunning, symbolic blow. The invincible hegemon had been caught sleeping, its control shown to be brittle. The response from Sparta was swift and furious, a declaration of war to reclaim its lost prestige. But this was not the Sparta of old, moving with slow, assured purpose. This was a Sparta acting from pique, from a need to reassert a dominance that was already slipping through its fingers. The ensuing conflict, the Boeotian War, would reveal every weakness the long peace had nurtured. Sparta marched to crush Thebes, expecting the old formula to hold. The Spartan phalanx would meet the enemy, and the enemy would break. But Thebes had learned, and Thebes had produced a military genius, Epaminondas. At the Battle of Leuctra, in 371 BC, the unthinkable happened. Epaminondas did not play by the traditional rules of hoplite warfare. He massed his troops in a devastatingly deep column on his left wing, directly opposite the Spartan king and his elite troops. He held his weaker right wing back. This was not a meeting of two lines. It was a hammer aimed at the anvil of the Spartan command. The Theban sacred band, an elite unit bound by loyalty, led the charge. When the forces collided, the Spartan right wing, for the first time in living memory, did not simply push forward. It was stopped. Then it was pushed back. Then it shattered. King Cleombrotus fell. The core of the Spartan peerage was slaughtered. The myth of Spartan invincibility on land died on that field alongside hundreds of its finest men. The news, when it reached the city, was met with a silence so profound it was itself a kind of scream. The unshakable had been shaken. The impossible had occurred. What is left for a society whose entire identity, whose reason for being, has just been publicly disproven on a battlefield? The defeat at Leuctra was more than a military loss. It was a metaphysical catastrophe. It broke the spell Sparta had cast over Greece for a century. Almost immediately, the Peloponnesian League, that masterpiece of hegemonic control, unraveled. Allies saw their chance and took it. Cities expelled their Spartan harmosts and declared their independence. The careful, decades-old structure of alliances collapsed like a tower of sand before a wave. Sparta's empire vanished in a season. Its power retreated to its original borders, but even those borders were now threatened. For Epaminondas was not finished. He intended not just to defeat Sparta, but to break its power forever. The following year, the Theban general did what no enemy had dared for centuries. He invaded the Peloponnese itself, not for a raid, but for a permanent reckoning. He marched his army right into the heart of Spartan territory, into the valley of the Eurotas River. The sight of an enemy host on the sacred soil of Laconia was a profound psychological shock. The Spartans, their numbers crippled, could only watch from behind the walls of their unwalled city. Another irony, for a city that had never needed walls now found itself defenseless. But Epaminondas had a more strategic goal than sacking Sparta itself. He marched south, to the region of Messenia. And there, he performed an act of political surgery that would cripple Sparta for all time. He declared the Helots of Messenia free. He founded a new, fortified city, Messene, on Mount Ithome, and invited the liberated population to make it their capital. With one stroke, he removed the very foundation of the Spartan economy and way of life. The vast, resentful sea upon which the Spartan ship had sailed was now drained away. The state was left beached, stranded, and utterly impoverished. The engine of its greatness had been dismantled by its greatest enemy. What remains of a warrior society when the reason for its warriors is gone? The dust of the Theban army settled, not on a conquered city, but on a transformed world. Epaminondas did not burn Sparta to the ground. He did something far more permanent. He changed the land itself. The liberation of Messenia was a stroke of strategic genius that cut deeper than any sword. For centuries, the fertile plains of Messenia had been the belly that fed the Spartan beast. Its helots had tilled the soil, tended the flocks, and provided the economic leisure that allowed every Spartan male to be a full-time soldier. That foundation was now gone. Overnight, Sparta lost not just territory, but its entire reason for being. The rigid social system, the agoge, the professional army, all of it was predicated on the exploitation of that captive population. What is a master without servants? What is a warrior society without the spoils of its original, defining war? The return of the surviving Spartans from Leuctra was not a homecoming, but a funeral procession for an era. They passed through a countryside that was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. The helot villages they had overseen for generations were empty. The fields, soon to be claimed by the new state of Mycenae, lay fallow. The economic reality was immediate and brutal. Without the labor of Messenia, the Spartan citizen had to work his own land or starve. The perfect warrior, whose hands were meant only for the spear and shield, now had to callous them with the plow. The distinction between the Spartan master and the helot, a distinction that was the bedrock of their identity, began to blur in the most practical, humiliating way. Can you maintain a posture of divine superiority when you are sweating in your own field, next to the few helots who remain? The psychological blow was even greater. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The aura of fear and respect that had been their greatest asset evaporated. In the councils of Greece, Sparta's voice, once the final word, was now just one among many, and often a mocked one. The allies were gone. The treasury was empty. The population was decimated. The state entered a long, grim winter of introspection and survival. The great questions that had been deferred for a century now demanded answers. How does a society built for expansion and dominance learn to merely exist? How does it redefine itself when its core purpose has been surgically removed? The internal reforms that followed were desperate, patchwork attempts to stem the bleeding. Kings and ephors proposed radical, once unthinkable ideas. There was talk of reforming the land laws, of redistributing property to boost the citizen rolls. There were murmurs of allowing non-Spartans who fought bravely to gain some form of status. But each proposal crashed against the immovable rocks of tradition and vested interest. The wealthy elites who had profited from the empire fought to keep their newly acquired lands and privileges. The conservative Gerousia saw any change to the ancient rhythms of Lycurgus as sacrilege. The society that had been so agile in war became paralyzed in peace. It was trapped between the desperate need to adapt and the terrifying fear of losing itself completely in the process. Is it better to die as you were, or to live as something else? The world, however, did not pause for Sparta's crisis. A new power was rising in the north, one that would make the conflicts of the Greek city-states look like squabbles between children. The kingdom of Macedon, under the brilliant, ruthless Philip II, was unifying with terrifying speed. Philip had studied Greek warfare, including the lessons of Epaminondas, and improved upon it. He created a professional army, the Macedonian phalanx armed with the long Sarissa pike, and combined it with devastating cavalry. He was a master of both battle and bribery. One by one, the divided Greek cities fell under his influence, either by conquest or cunning diplomacy. Sparta watched, isolated and weakened, from its shrunken domain in the south. Philip sent a message. It was said to be a simple choice. You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city. The Spartan reply, according to legend, was a single word, if. It was a magnificent defiance, a last, proud echo of the old spirit. But it was also the defiance of a ghost. Philip, calculating and pragmatic, simply bypassed them. He had no need to waste resources on a prestige target that no longer commanded the Greek world. He defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at Kyrenia in 338 BC and became the master of Greece. He formed the League of Corinth, a pan-Hellenic alliance under Macedonian hegemony. Every major Greek state joined. Every one, except Sparta. In its proud isolation, it refused the summons. It was a statement of principle, but also an admission of irrelevance. The currents of history had shifted, and Sparta was now a rock in the backwater, stubbornly unmoving as the river flowed around it. What is pride when it is the last thing you have left? The next generation brought an even greater tide. Philip's son Alexander embarked on his epic conquest of the Persian Empire. He called for troops from all of Greece, his allied forces. Again, Sparta stood apart. While the glory and wealth of the East flooded into Macedonian and Greek hands, Sparta remained in its laconic poverty, its gaze fixed stubbornly on the past. It watched as a new Hellenistic world was born, a world of vast kingdoms, cosmopolitan cities, and revolutionary ideas. A world for which the Spartan model, insular, infantry-based, ritualistic, had no place. The Agoge still produced fine soldiers, but the world no longer needed that specific kind of soldier. The type of war had changed. The scale had changed. While others adapted, Sparta preserved, like an insect in amber, beautiful to look at but fundamentally of another time. Yet, the embers of the old fire still glowed. There were moments of flickering resistance, attempts to reclaim a shred of former glory. One such moment came decades later, when a Spartan king named Agis III attempted a rebellion against Macedonian rule while Alexander was campaigning in the distant east. It was a bold gamble, a spark of the old ambition. For a time, it seemed it might catch. But the Macedonians, even in their master's absence, were too powerful, too organized. Agis was defeated and killed in battle. The rebellion was crushed with finality. It was the last, gasping attempt of the Spartan body politic to act as a major power. After that, the city settled into a long, twilight existence. It became a museum of itself, a place where tourists from the new Hellenistic world would come to see the legendary simplicity of the Spartans, to watch their strange drills and listen to their brief, sharp speech. They were now a curiosity, a living relic. The fall was complete. The hegemon had become a historical exhibit. But is the final chapter of a great story written only in decline? Or is there something else, a quieter legacy, that emerges from the ashes of power? The long, slow sunset of Sparta's power was not marked by a single dramatic collapse, but by a gradual fading, like the bleaching of a once vibrant cloak left too long in the sun. After the failure of Agis's rebellion, the city-state resigned itself to a narrower destiny. No longer a shaper of events, it became a subject of them, buffeted by the winds of larger powers, Macedon, than the rival Hellenistic kingdoms that squabbled over Alexander's shattered empire. The great Game of Thrones had moved to a global stage, and Sparta was left with a local, dwindling audience. Its kings now spent less time leading phalanxes to glory and more time navigating treacherous diplomatic waters, trying to play the weak against the strong just to preserve a sliver of autonomy. The art of politics had replaced the art of war, and it was an art for which the Spartan temperament was uniquely unsuited. Internally, the crisis of citizenship reached a point of no return. The number of full Spartiates, the homoioi, plummeted to a few hundred, a ghostly echo of the thousands who had once dominated Greece. The vast lands of Laconia, now shorn of Messenia, were concentrated in the hands of a tiny, wealthy elite, mostly women, as the complex inheritance laws had paradoxically put enormous property in female control. This created a society utterly inverted from its original ideal. A few extremely rich landowners, a mass of disenfranchised and resentful lesser Spartans and perioikoi, the free but non-citizen dwellers, and a hollowed-out military tradition. The Agoge still existed, but what was it for? It produced magnificent soldiers for a state that could barely field an army. The ritual continued, long after the purpose had evaporated. What is the sound of a tradition clapping with only one hand? Desperation finally forced a revolution from within. A century after Leuctra, a fiery king named Cleomenes III seized power with a radical vision: to restore Sparta to greatness by force of will. He saw the rot clearly, the grotesque inequality, the moribund institutions. With the support of the disenfranchised and the desperate, he staged a coup. Ephors who opposed him were killed. The ancient Gerousia was stripped of power. Then, in a move that would have made Lycurgus shudder, he announced a sweeping reform, a cancellation of debts and a radical redistribution of land. He aimed to recreate a broad base of citizen soldiers, to manufacture the equality that had been lost. He even enrolled new citizens from among the perioikoi and trained them in the old ways. For a brief, vivid moment, it seemed the phoenix might rise. And for a moment, it did. Cleomenes, a skilled general, led his revitalized army on a stunning campaign across the Peloponnese. He defeated the armies of the Achaean League, Sparta's old regional rival. Fear rippled through Greece. The ghost was walking again, and it had teeth. The old Spartan scarlet was seen on the march, and it stirred ancient anxieties. But this revival was an illusion, a final fever dream of the body politic. Cleomenes' Sparta was a revolutionary state, built on tyranny and radical social upheaval, not the slow, organic discipline of the past. It was Sparta in name and uniform only, a brilliant but brittle imitation. More importantly, it now faced not divided Greek cities, but the immense, organized power of a Hellenistic superpower. The Kingdom of Macedon, and its client the Achaean League, called for help from the south. The call was answered by Antigonus III Doson of Macedon. The clash came at Sellasia in 222 BC. Cleomenes, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, positioned his forces on two hills guarding the approach to Sparta. He fought with the desperate courage of a man trying to resurrect a dream. The battle was fierce, brutal. But the Macedonian military machine, with its integrated phalanx and cavalry, was the evolution that had rendered the classic Spartan model obsolete. The Spartan lines were broken. Cleomenes' new citizen army was annihilated. The king himself, witnessing the total destruction, fled to Egypt. The reformer was gone, his reforms ash. The last, great military gamble of Sparta had ended in absolute ruin. With the defeat at Sellasia, something more than an army died. It was the death of the idea that the old Sparta could ever be reborn. The path forward led only downward. In the aftermath, Sparta was humiliated. A Macedonian garrison was installed. For the first time in its long history, the city endured foreign troops within its bounds. The symbols of its independence were trampled. The long retreat from history was now a forced march. The following centuries saw Sparta become a pawn in the Roman conquest of Greece. It made occasional feudal stands, aligning with one Roman faction against another, always betting on the wrong side. In 195 BC, it was besieged by the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, and its tyrant, Nabis, was defeated. Rome, however, in a strange twist, did not destroy it. Instead, they liberated the surrounding cities Sparta had been trying to reconquer and forced it into the Achaean League, its old enemy. The ultimate insult was to be saved from obliteration and made a minor member of a provincial coalition. The lion was now a muzzled dog, led on a Roman leash. The final, symbolic end came in 146 BC. When the Achaean League foolishly rose in revolt against Roman authority, the legions under Lucius Mummius crushed them with merciless efficiency. The great city of Corinth was razed to the ground as a lesson. Sparta, having been forced into the League, was caught in the punishment. Though it avoided Corinth's fate, it was stripped of any remaining pretense of autonomy. It was incorporated into the Roman province of Achaea. The long story of Spartan sovereignty was over. It was now just another name on a Roman tax roll, a quaint stop on the grand tour of educated Romans who came to see the birthplace of a legendary discipline they could admire but never emulate. The fall was total. From hegemon to province. From feared adversary to tourist attraction. The journey was complete. But here, at the nadir, A question whispers. If the story of Sparta was merely one of rise and fall, of power gained and power lost, would it still grip us so tightly centuries later? Perhaps the true legacy of Sparta was not its empire, which was brief, nor its political system, which collapsed. Perhaps its legacy was something harder, more intangible, and ideal. The ideal of sacrifice. The ideal of putting the community above the self. The ideal of enduring hardship for a greater cause. These were the codes they lived by, and in their brutal, flawed, extreme way, they demonstrated what human beings could endure, could achieve, when bound by such codes. They showed the terrifying beauty and the profound cost of a society all pointed in one direction. Their failure was a lesson in the impossibility of freezing time, of resisting change. But their memory became a myth, a standard against which discipline, courage, and resilience would forever be measured. They fell as a power, but they ascended as an idea. And ideas, as we know, have a strange way of never truly dying. They sleep, waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted. What part of the Spartan ideal, stripped of its cruelty and context, still speaks to something within us today? Under the heavy blanket of Roman rule, Sparta entered a phase that was neither death nor life, but a kind of prolonged slumber. The fierce pulse of its own history became a distant, fading echo. Roman governors administered justice, Roman legions kept the peace, and Roman taxes were collected. The agoge, that legendary forge of warriors, was allowed to continue, not as a vital national institution, but as a curious anachronism, a living museum exhibit for wealthy Roman tourists. Young Spartans still trained, still endured hardships, but they did so now for the amusement and philosophical reflection of outsiders. The performance of their pain had become a spectacle. Can a ritual retain its soul when its original, deadly serious purpose has been utterly stripped away? These tourists, writers like Cicero and later Plutarch, would visit and write letters filled with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw in the surviving Spartan customs a stark, pure mirror held up to their own decadent, complex Roman world. The Roman ideal of virtus, manly virtue, found a primal ancestor in the Spartan ethos. Senators would speak nostalgically of Lycurgan discipline while enjoying the lavish comforts of their villas. Sparta became less a place and more a concept, a rhetorical tool. It was a symbol of lost austerity, of a severe and simple virtue that the sophisticated Romans admired from a safe distance, much like one might admire a dangerous, beautiful predator from behind the bars of a cage. The city's power was gone, but its brand, in a strange way, was undergoing its first repackaging. Yet, even as a museum piece, the embers of identity smoldered. There were occasional, faint sparks. During the Roman civil wars, Sparta, like many Greek cities, was forced to choose sides. Sometimes, a local Spartan leader would manage to raise a contingent of troops in the old style, fighting for Pompey or later for Mark Antony. These were mercenaries in all but name, selling their archaic military skills to Roman patrons. They fought bravely, these descendants of legends, but they fought for the causes of others, for gold and the fleeting favor of a foreign master. The spear that had once decided the fate of Greece was now a hireling's tool. What does it do to a people's spirit to rent out their heritage for another empire's battles? The world continued to turn, and new currents of thought washed over the Greek peninsula. A profound spiritual revolution was stirring, one that would challenge every ancient value, Roman and Greek alike. Christianity began to spread, its message of universal love, humility, and the kingdom of God standing in direct, stark opposition to the Spartan core values of martial pride, state supremacy, and physical excellence. The apostles preached in Corinth and Athens. Did their words ever drift down the winding roads into Laconia? One can imagine the message being met with bewitched confusion by the few who still clung to the old ways. The last true Spartans would have heard tales of a god who died on a cross, who taught to turn the other cheek, who valued the meek. It would have sounded like madness. Their entire civilization had been built on the principle of never turning your cheek, of meeting force with overwhelming force, of valuing the strong. The coming of this new faith marked the closing of one spiritual epoch and the slow, painful dawn of another. How does a culture built on the body confront a doctrine built on the soul? As the Roman Empire itself began to fracture, Sparta faded further into obscurity. It was bypassed by major trade routes, spared from some of the worst barbarian invasions that ravaged other parts of Greece, not because it was strong, but because it was irrelevant. The great walls that other cities built for defense were never raised here. Its defense was now its inconsequence. The population dwindled, the grand public spaces fell into disrepair, and the memories of the kings and the phalanxes became the stuff of local shepherd tales. The stone monuments that had witnessed centuries of drills now watched only the slow crawl of weeds and the passing of seasons. The voice of history had grown very quiet here. Then, in a final, ironic twist of fate, the Spartan name was invoked one last time for a military purpose, but not by Spartans. In the late Byzantine era, a warlord named William of Villehardouin built a massive, looming fortress on a peak overlooking the Spartan plain. He called it Mistress. And as the centuries turned, the population, seeking security, gradually abandoned the ancient town of Sparta below and clustered on the slopes around this Frankish castle. A new city grew, a thriving Byzantine cultural center, while old Sparta became a field of ruins. Mistras became the seat of a despot of the Morea, a last flickering candle of Byzantine Greek rule. So the geographical stage of Sparta's epic saw a final act, but the players were different. The costumes were medieval, the faith was Orthodox Christianity, the language was a evolved Greek. The ghosts of Leonidas and Lysander slept undisturbed in the valley below. This new city, Mistras, had its own moment in the sun. It was a center of art, philosophy, and late Byzantine learning. Its churches were filled with breathtaking frescoes, a world away from the austere, bronzed idols of the past. For a time, it was more important than the ruin it overlooked. But histories will kept turning. In 1460, nearly a decade after the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks conquered Mistras. The last despot surrendered. The Peloponnese was under a new empire. The fortress on the hill, like the city in the valley before it, lost its purpose. Both were now relics, one stacked upon the other, layers of forgotten power. The fall of Sparta was now so complete it was buried under the fall of its successor. And so, for centuries, Sparta truly slept. The Ottoman era saw it as a minor village, known locally as Paleologos or simply the Old City. Travelers from Western Europe, steeped in the newly rediscovered classics of Plutarch and Herodotus, began to seek it out in the 18th century. They came with their copies of texts, trying to match the lush descriptions of ancient writers with the sleepy, impoverished hamlet they found. They scratched their heads at the meager streams, wondering how this could be the Eurotas of legend. They clambered over the faint, grassy outlines where the temples and barracks might have been. The disconnect was profound. The myth in their minds was colossal. The reality at their feet was humble, almost apologetic. This was the final stage of the fall, not just oblivion, but a failure of the landscape to live up to the story. The silence was now so deep it echoed with the whispers of all that had been lost. But is anything ever truly lost if its story is still told, if its name still stirs something in the heart? The physical power was dust, but the spectral power of the idea was just beginning its long, strange afterlife. The slumber was deep, but not eternal. A new dawn, fueled by ink and paper, began to stir the ghost. The Renaissance had unlocked the ancient texts, and the Enlightenment philosophers devoured them. In the salons of Paris and the lecture halls of Edinburgh, Sparta was exhumed not as a corpse, but as a provocative idea. Thinkers like Rousseau gazed back across the millennia and saw not a brutal military state, but a vision of social cohesion and civic virtue that stood in stark, flattering contrast to the ornate corruption of their own royal courts. They idealized Sparta's supposed equality, its rejection of luxury, its subordination of the individual to the common good. They polished the legend, scrubbing away the helotry, the infanticide, the cultural barrenness, leaving behind a gleaming utopian model. Sparta became Lacedaemon, a philosophical construct, a weapon to critique modern society. Its fall was not a tragedy of overreach, but a moral fable about the corruption of virtue by wealth and empire. What does it say about us, that we so often remake the past in the image of our own present needs? This philosophical resurrection bled directly into the birth pangs of new nations. As the American colonists stirred against British rule, the parallels were drawn. Here was a small, disciplined, virtuous people standing up against a vast, wealthy, corrupt empire. Pamphleteers invoked the spirit of Leonidas at Thermopylae, the Spartan virtues of frugality, resilience, and martial readiness became republican ideals. Later, during the French Revolution, the cry for égalité found a fierce ancestor in the Spartan mirage. Robespierre and the Jacobins spoke of Spartan austerity as a revolutionary virtue, a purifying fire to burn away the decadence of the monarchy. The fall of Sparta served as a warning. A republic that loses its virtue is doomed. The ghosts of the Agouge were now marching in the streets of Paris, their image reshaped for a wholly new kind of struggle. But can an idea, once weaponized, ever be controlled by those who wield it? The 19th century brought a different lens, the cold, analytical gaze of modern historiography and nationalism. As Germany unified, scholars and statesmen looked for historical models of discipline and military excellence. The Spartan paradigm was studied, dissected, and often dangerously misapplied. The focus shifted from the philosopher's utopia to the strategist's manual. The relentless training, the sacrifice, the cult of the state. These were elements that resonated with emerging nationalist ideologies seeking to forge a unified, potent people. The fall was now analyzed as a military and demographic failure, a case study in what happens when a master race fails to maintain its numbers or adapt its tactics. The Romantic haze began to harden into a more sinister, utilitarian admiration. How thin is the line between learning from history and trying to resurrect its most dangerous ghosts? Meanwhile, on the very soil of Laconia, a tangible revival was taking place. With the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, the new nation-state of Greece sought to connect itself directly to the glories of its ancient past. The name, Sparta, carried immense symbolic weight. In 1834, a decree by the newly installed King Otto ordered the establishment of a new town near the ancient site. Modern Sparta was born. It was a deliberate act of necromancy, an attempt to draw the ancient prestige into the modern project of nation-building. Wide boulevards were laid out, neoclassical buildings erected. It was a clean, planned town, a hopeful gesture trying to bridge 2,000 years of silence. But the new Sparta was, and is, a normal Greek provincial town. The past is a quiet neighbor, not a living heartbeat. The magnificent statue of King Leonidas in the central square stands as both a tribute and a confession that the true Sparta exists now only in bronze and memory. What does a modern town do with a legend living in its backyard? The 20th century, with its cataclysmic wars and ideological battles, subjected the Spartan ideal to its most severe tests and darkest appropriations. Totalitarian regimes, particularly the Nazis, explicitly co-opted the iconography. The SS invoked the Agouge as a model for their elite training. The idea of a racially pure, militarized society living at the expense of a subjugated underclass found a horrifying parallel. This was the ultimate corruption of the myth, stripping it of even its philosophical pretensions and bending it to serve an engine of industrialized murder. The fall of Sparta was now seen by many as a deserved fate for a proto-fascist state. The legend was tainted, its symbols made toxic by association. After the war, a profound reaction set in among scholars and the public. The focus swung sharply toward exposing the brutal reality behind the myth. The systemic violence, the oppression of the helots, the rigid, joyless hierarchy. The pendulum had swung from uncritical admiration to wholesale condemnation. Was the true Sparta finally being seen, or were we just creating a new monster to fit a new era's anxieties? Yet, through all these reinterpretations, the philosophical ideal, the nationalist model, the totalitarian nightmare, the scholarly deconstruction, the core narrative never lost its grip on the popular imagination. But perhaps because at its heart, stripped of all political baggage, the story of Sparta contains elemental human dramas that transcend time. The struggle of a community against impossible odds, the terrible cost of discipline, the tension between individual desire and collective duty, the inevitable decay of even the hardest things. It is a story about excellence and its price, about glory and its ash. And so, we find it everywhere. In the gyms where people push their bodies beyond comfort, a faint echo of the eroded ethos persists. In stories of doomed last stands, from the Alamo to cinematic battles in distant galaxies, the template of Thermopylae is resketched. In boardrooms and sports teams that preach a culture of sacrifice and unity, the language, however diluted, harks back to that ancient, brutal compact. The fall itself is the crucial part of the story. It provides the tragedy, the lesson, the poignant reminder that nothing, no matter how strong, lasts forever. It completes the arc, satisfying a deep need in us for meaning in rise and fall. The city-state is gone, but the narrative machine it built is perhaps its most enduring invention. It continues to produce meaning, to challenge us, to force the question, what would you give up for your community, for your ideals, and at what point does the cost become the very thing that destroys you? The story is a mirror, and we keep looking into it, seeing different reflections in different ages. The modern gaze upon Sparta is a fractured one, a prism splitting a single source of light into conflicting colors. We no longer see a monolith, but a dilemma. This is the final, perhaps most mature, stage of its legacy. Not worship, not condemnation, but a permanent, uneasy conversation. Scholars in universities continue to sift through the scant archaeological record, debating the exact nature of the Syssitia, the true power of the Ephesus, the daily reality of a helot. Each new finding subtly adjusts the picture, chipping away at both the utopian and the dystopian caricatures. They present us with a society of profound contradictions, both deeply communal and brutally exclusionary, astonishingly stable for centuries yet inherently fragile. This academic Sparta is a puzzle that can never be fully solved, and that is why it remains endlessly fascinating. It forces us to sit with complexity, to hold two opposing truths in our minds at once. Can we admire the courage while abhorring the cruelty? Can we respect the cohesion while rejecting the oppression? This nuanced tension has found fertile ground in modern popular culture. The epic film Star 300 Star, with its stylized violence and mythic tone, did not present a history lesson. It presented a power fantasy, a visual poem about masculine sacrifice and defiance. It was Sparta as heavy metal album cover, loud, visceral, and unapologetically exaggerated. It ignited a new generation's interest, but it was a Sparta of aesthetics, of abs and adrenaline. Contrast that with more thoughtful portrayals in literature or games that explore the perspective of the helot, the marginalized Spartan woman, or the disillusioned soldier. These narratives ask the uncomfortable questions the myth often glosses over. They force us into the shoes of those who paid the price for Spartan glory. This is the story's evolution, from a hymn to the victors to a chorus of all the voices, including the silenced ones. The fall in these retellings is not just a military defeat, but a moral reckoning long overdue. And what of the physical Sparta today? The modern town of Sparta goes about its daily life under the bright Greek sun. Citrus groves flourish where hoplites once drilled. The ruins of the ancient theater are a quiet archaeological site, not a stage for world-altering decisions. The colossal statue of Leonidas stares down the main street, a silent guardian of a memory most residents live beside, not within. The past is present here as tourism, as academic study, as a faint civic pride. But the fierce, all-consuming fire that defined the place for centuries is utterly banked. This is the ultimate meaning of the fall, not destruction, but normalization. The extraordinary became ordinary. The terrifying became picturesque. The revolution became a relic. Is this the fate of all great passions, to be cooled by time into something manageable, visitable, and safe? Yet, In that very safety lies a new kind of power. Freed from the burden of being a political or military blueprint, the story of Sparta achieves a purer form of immortality. It becomes a tool for thinking. Entrepreneurs might mine it for lessons on building a strong corporate culture. Psychologists might study it to understand group dynamics and extreme conditioning. Philosophers debate its version of freedom. Was the Spartan citizen, bound by iron law, truly free, or was he the most enslaved of all? The narrative is a sandbox for testing ideas about society, sacrifice, and human limits. Its fall is the critical case study in sustainability. Any system, the story whispers, no matter how perfectly engineered, contains the seeds of its own destruction if it cannot adapt. It is a warning against rigidity, against the pride that believes a system can be made perfect and then frozen in time. The ruins are a lesson in entropy. This brings us to the quiet, personal resonance of the tale, especially here in the sleepy owl space, where history meets reflection. Beyond the grand themes of empire and ideology, the Spartan story touches on intimate human struggles. The struggle to belong, the struggle to be brave, the struggle to meet expectations that feel impossible, the agony of watching something you've dedicated your life to, a cause, a tradition, a way of life, slowly fade into irrelevance. In their extreme, the Spartans magnify these universal experiences. We may not face the Persian horde, but we face our own overwhelming trials. We may not train in the agoge, but we too are shaped by the disciplines and expectations of our families, our cultures, our times. Their fall reminds us that all our striving, all our building, exists within the relentless flow of time. Nothing we make is permanent, and there is a strange comfort in that, a humbling peace. It relieves us of the impossible burden of building forever, and asks instead, what will you build well, and with what character, for the time it is given? So, as we approach the final portions of this long journey from peak to twilight, we are not just recounting historical facts. We are tracing the life cycle of an idea. We have seen the idea made flesh in bronze and blood, ruling the Peloponnese. We have seen the flesh weaken and fail. We have seen the idea stripped from its body, purified, corrupted, debated, and endlessly recycled. The city fell. The people changed. The way of life vanished. But the story refused to die. It proved more adaptable than the society that created it. It learned to live in books, in speeches, in films, in our very language. The word Spartan itself is a fossilized piece of that world, still used to describe austerity and toughness. The fall, then, was not an end, but a metamorphosis. The caterpillar of a warrior state dissolved, and from its chrysalis emerged the butterfly of a timeless narrative. This is the paradox we sit with now. The physical Sparta was a prisoner of its time, its geography, its rigid rules. It was anchored, and when the world changed, the anchor held it fast until it drowned. But the story of Sparta became unmoored. It travels light, across centuries and continents, changing shape to fit the vessel that carries it. It is more free now than its citizens ever were. In letting go of concrete power, it gained a far more pervasive, subtle kind of influence. It whispers to the soldier, cautions the philosopher, inspires the athlete, and warns the statesman. It asks its questions of every generation anew. And perhaps that is the final, unexpected triumph, not to have avoided fall, but to have made the story of that fall so compelling that we keep resurrecting its questions, ensuring that in some way, the conversation they started never truly ends. The echoes in the valley of the Eurotas may have faded, but the echoes in the chamber of human curiosity go on and on. What question does Sparta ask of you, here and now? To understand the depth of the fall, we must finally turn from the sweeping narrative and look into the eyes of the last who truly believed. Imagine a Spartan man, born in the twilight of the 3rd century BC, after the disaster at Sellasia. He is raised by a father whose own father fought for Cleomenes, that last, brilliant flash of the old flame. The agoge he endures is a ghost of its former self. The rituals are observed, the hardships imposed, but the certainty is gone. He trains not for the defense of a mighty hegemony, but for the defense of a memory. When he takes his place in the remnants of the phalanx, the shield feels as heavy as ever, but the line is pathetically thin. He can see the doubt in the eyes of the man next to him. They drill on ground that feels like a graveyard. The purpose has curdled into performance. What does it do to the human spirit to dedicate your life to perfecting an art the world has declared obsolete? This man's world is one of quiet, relentless subtraction. He hears tales of the kings of old who commanded continents of the Greek mind, but his own king is a petty factional player begging for scraps from Macedonian or Roman tables. The great festivals once attended by envoys from across the known world are now local affairs. The iron currency, once a point of prideful isolation, is a joke in a world running on silver and gold. He might marry, but the laws are so tangled, the citizenry so shrunken, that the future seems to contract with each passing year. The horizons of his life, once theoretically boundless for a Spartan warrior, have closed into the hills of Laconia. His greatness is behind him, inherited, not something he can build. He lives in the long, painful afterglow of a sun that has already set. How do you find meaning when your destiny is to be a caretaker of a fading legacy? Contrast this with the psyche at Sparta's zenith. Imagine a peer of the early 4th century, a man who stood in the phalanx that dominated Greece. His world was one of expansion, of tangible fear and respect flowing back from every frontier. When his king called, armies of allies assembled. When he marched, cities made calculations of survival or destruction based on his movement. The horizon stretched to Ionia, to Thrace, to Sicily. The future was a thing to be shaped by the tip of his spear. His discipline, however harsh, had an immediate, powerful reward: supremacy. His sacrifice purchased not nostalgia, but dominion. The two men are separated by less than a century, but they inhabit different universes. One breathes the thin, cold air of peak altitude. The other wanders the shaded, forgotten valleys of the descent. Is it worse to never have had glory, or to have inherited only its hollow shell? The fall, therefore, was not merely a political or military event. It was a slow-motion psychological catastrophe for the collective Spartan mind. The core of their identity, the unshakable belief in their own inherent superiority and martial inevitability, was dismantled piece by piece. First by the Theban spear at Leuctra, a shock to the system. Then by the liberation of Messenia, an amputation of their economic self. Then by the long humiliation of existing in a world that moved on without them. The trauma would have bred a complex mix of traits: a brittle, exaggerated pride to mask the insecurity, a nostalgic fundamentalism clinging ever tighter to empty forms, a deep-seated resentment of the outside world that had moved past them. We see this pattern in fallen powers throughout history. The psychology of decline is often more revealing than the events of decline itself. This internal unraveling had a cultural counterpart. At its height, Sparta produced almost nothing we would call art, literature, or architecture for its own sake. Its cultural product was the perfect soldier and the stable state. In its decline, it could not even produce that. The creative energy of a society, even one as focused as Sparta, must go somewhere. When its primary outlet, warfare for expansion and hegemony, was blocked, that energy seems to have turned inward, festering as factional strife, bitter legalism, and a sterile obsession with ritual purity. There were no great Spartan poets of the Hellenistic age singing of their loss, no philosophers synthesizing a new path. There was only a sullen, diminishing silence. The fall was, in a way, a failure of imagination. When the old script became impossible to perform, they had no other script to write. They could only repeat the old lines, more faintly each time, until the audience left and the theater went dark. And what of the land itself? The very geography of Laconia tells a story of subtraction. The rich, sprawling plains of Messenia, the source of its wealth and the root of its original sin, were gone. What remained was a narrower, more confined valley. The mental map of every Spartan shrank. Their world, which had once encompassed the Aegean in its strategic thinking, retracted to the passes leading into their own home. The mountains that had been a protective ring became, in the long twilight, more like the walls of a quiet prison. The Eurotas River still flowed, but its waters no longer carried the whispers of empire, only the murmurs of a local, circumscribed life. The landscape itself seemed to forget its former purpose. This is the ultimate physical truth of a fall, the contraction of space, the diminishing of realm, both on the map and in the mind. So, we are left with this poignant image, a people who dedicated every facet of their society to the single goal of enduring power, finding that the one thing they could not endure was their own success and the change it inevitably wrought. They built a fortress against time, and time, as it always does, found a way in. The cracks were not just in their battle lines, but in their belief, in their economy, in their very spirit. The story of the fall is the story of that fortress slowly becoming a tomb, and then a museum, and then a memory. It is a profound meditation on the limits of human design. We can engineer remarkable things. A society of peerless warriors, a constitution of balances, a culture of unbelievable toughness. But we cannot engineer permanence. The river of history flows on, and even the hardest stones are eventually worn smooth and carried to a different sea. This brings us to the final turn in our journey. We have traced the arc from the blinding sun of hegemony to the deep shadows of irrelevance. We have seen the idea set loose upon the world. But before we close this long narration for Sleepy Owl, we must gather the threads. We must ask not just how it fell, but what, in the very heart of its being, made the fall not just likely, but perhaps inevitable. What was the original flaw in the Spartan diamond? Was it the helotry? The rigidity? The inability to adapt? Or was it something more subtle, a tragic flaw written into the opening lines of its glorious, terrible story? The final act of understanding awaits. To find the seed of the fall, we must return not to the moment of defeat, but to the moment of creation. We must look at the original, founding compact of the Spartan state. Its entire magnificent, terrifying structure was not designed for growth, for adaptation, or for peace. It was designed for one thing: to hold a subjugated population in check, to hold a rigid social order against the chaos of human desire, to hold a small elite in perpetual military readiness against internal and external threats. The system was a masterpiece of control, but control is a defensive posture. It is about maintaining a status quo against the forces of entropy. And entropy, in the form of historical change, economic evolution, and new ideas, is the one force against which no defense is permanent. The very perfection of the Spartan system in its own context was its death warrant for any other. It was a solved equation in a world that kept introducing new variables. Consider the helotry. This was the radioactive core around which the entire reactor was built. The need to control the vast, resentful Messenian and Laconian helot populations dictated everything. It demanded a permanently militarized citizenry. It justified the brutal agauge, forging boys into instruments of repression as much as defense. It necessitated the inward turn, the suspicion of outsiders, the expulsion of foreign influences, all to prevent the spark of rebellion from finding external kindling. The Spartan was not just a warrior, he was a prison guard for an entire nation living within his borders. This existential anxiety, this perpetual state of low-grade siege, fueled their discipline but also poisoned their potential. It made them conservative to the point of paralysis. Any significant change risked upsetting the delicate, brutal balance upon which their society rested. Can you build a dynamic, expanding future when you are forever looking backward over your shoulder, guarding the past? This leads to the second fatal flaw, the cult of the unchanging law. The Spartans attributed their constitution to the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus. It was considered perfect, divine, and most catastrophically, complete. The task of subsequent generations was not to improve or adapt it, but to preserve it. This mindset sanctified stagnation. When new challenges arose, the rise of naval power, the need for protracted campaigns, the influx of foreign wealth. The instinct was not to innovate, but to ask, what would Lycurgus do? The answer, inevitably, was to cling tighter to the old ways, even as the world rendered them obsolete. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, became the priesthood of this orthodoxy. Their wisdom was the wisdom of preservation, not innovation. In a rapidly changing Greek world, Sparta chose to be a museum of itself while it was still alive. A living thing that refuses to grow is not staying pure. It is dying. Economically, the system was a vacuum. It produced almost nothing for exchange. Its currency was deliberately cumbersome. Its citizenry was forbidden from manual labor or commerce. Its wealth was extracted, not created, first from the Helots, later from conquered territories. This is an extractive model, not a generative one. It can only last as long as there are new resources to extract. Once the expansion stopped after the Peloponnesian War, and especially after the loss of Messenia, the economic model collapsed. There was no internal engine of productivity, no merchant class, no technological innovation to create new wealth. The sudden influx of Persian gold after the war was a toxin because the society had no healthy economic metabolism to process it. The money didn't circulate and build, it pooled and corrupted. The fall, in economic terms, was simple. They ran out of other people's resources to take, and they had forgotten how to make their own. But perhaps the most human of their flaws was demographic. The Spartan system was brutal on its own people. The rigorous lifestyle, the constant warfare, the high standards for maintaining citizenship, all of these acted as a slow filter, reducing the precious pool of Spartiate males generation after generation. They prized quality, but they forgot that quantity has a quality all its own. A society that treats its own citizens as a non-renewable military resource will eventually face a simple arithmetic problem. Subtraction without sufficient addition equals zero. The problem of oliganthropy, the shortage of men, wasn't just a symptom of the fall. It was a direct, predictable result of the system's own unforgiving logic. They were consuming themselves in the very act of sustaining themselves. It was a slow societal suicide, dressed up as the highest virtue. So, we see a series of interconnected rings. The Helot system demanded militarization. Militarization demanded rigid social controls. Rigid controls prevented adaptation. Lack of adaptation led to economic and strategic stagnation. Stagnation led to decline and vulnerability. Each flaw reinforced the others, creating a perfect trap. The system lacked an escape valve, a mechanism for self-correction. When the Thebans under Epaminondas applied unprecedented pressure at Leuctra and then performed the radical surgery of liberating Messenia, they didn't just defeat an army, they kicked out the central pillar of this entire interlocking structure. The whole edifice was so perfectly balanced that removing one key piece caused the entire, intricate machine to shudder, seize, and never truly run again. This is the tragic essence of the Spartan story. They were not defeated because they were weak. They were defeated because they were strong in a way that became a fatal weakness. They were not flawed because they failed. They failed because their very strengths, amplified and unyielding, became flaws in a changing world. Their discipline became rigidity. Their cohesion became exclusivity. Their self-sufficiency became isolation. Their cultural purity became stagnation. The fall was not an accident. It was the logical conclusion of their founding premises, played out over centuries. It is the story of a people who solved the problem of their own survival so perfectly that they made themselves incapable of solving any other problem, especially the problem of their own success. And this is why their story echoes so deeply. It holds a universal cautionary tale. It asks us to look at our own institutions, our own beliefs, our own strengths. What works brilliantly today, what seems like an unassailable advantage, could it become the chain that binds us tomorrow? Are we, in our own ways, building systems that are too perfect, too closed, too focused on a single version of success? The Spartan warning whispers across the ages, beware the solution that is too complete, for it leaves no room for the questions the future will inevitably ask. The very thing that makes you invincible for a time may be the very thing that ensures you cannot endure for all time. As we approach the end of our journey together with Sleepy Owl, this is the quiet, lasting resonance, not of drums and spears, but of a silence that followed, and the lesson it left hanging in the air, waiting for us to understand.